Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely vital piece of history, how diverse minority communities in late 1800s and early 1900s Canada didn't just endure systemic discrimination, but actively pushed back and built lasting resilience. We're going to unpack these powerful, real-life stories of resistance using some incredible historical evidence. But first, let's start with a personal question. Have you ever been treated unfairly or felt judged by someone who literally didn't even know you? It's a hugely frustrating, isolating feeling, right? I ask this just to anchor ourselves, because the historical struggles we're about to explore weren't just abstract concepts. They were deeply personal to the workers, families, and children who lived through them every single day. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We'll look at Black communities taking action, Chinese community organizations, Italian workers striking back, Jewish garment workers protesting, and finally, how we connect that past to the present. Let's get right into it. Section 1. Black communities take action, fighting for rights on the railways and the ice. Picture this. It's the late 1800s. The federal government-owned Intercolonial Railway had hired a bunch of Black men as porters. They worked absolutely grueling hours and, unsurprisingly for the time, were paid way less than the white employees. But then, during a business slowdown in 1898, the railway abruptly fired its Black workers just to appease the unionized white workers. The immediate pushback, though, was powerful. Black churches were completely outraged and rallied behind the workers. Just listen to what Reverend Dr. J. Francis Robinson had to say. He hit the nail on the head, pointing out that if Black porters had been organized into unions like their white peers, the railway wouldn't have been able to just quietly displace them. Church leaders actually used their voting bloc to pressure Wilfrid Laurier's government, and eventually, since white unions refused them membership all the way until 1919, the workers just organized their very own union. Now, this systemic exclusion absolutely wasn't limited to the railways. We're talking about segregation here, deliberately separating different racial groups in a society. In both rural and urban areas, Black Canadians were forced into heavily segregated lives. Kids faced awful bullying in white schools or were just sent to completely segregated ones. Families were handed poor farmland, totally denied service in restaurants, and flat-out barred from living in certain neighborhoods or joining social clubs. But because they were shut out of those white sports leagues and clubs, the community built its own resilience. Take the Africville Seasides, a hockey team from around 1922 playing in the newly founded Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes. This league was a massive success. It gave players a real chance to showcase their immense talent. In fact, it was so popular that even white middle-class fans flocked to the games. Still, the broader fight for inclusion in professional sports was a marathon. It wasn't until 1958 that Canadian Willie O'Ree finally broke the NHL color barrier. And to put the painfully slow progress into perspective, by 2013, out of roughly 690 players in the NHL, a mere 22 were Black. It's a really stark reminder of the long-lasting echoes of that early segregation. Moving on to Section 2, Chinese Canadian Community Organizations. We'll see how they built essential support systems in the face of brutal exclusion. Over on the West Coast, growing anti-Chinese sentiment led to severe government hiring bans. Many Chinese people responded by starting their own businesses, but they were forced into Vancouver's absolute poorest neighborhoods, where terrible sanitation fueled massive public stereotyping. Check out this wild newspaper ad from the Vancouver Daily Advertiser in 1891. It literally screams, "Beware leprosy," using extreme fear-mongering and completely false health stereotypes to viciously attack Chinese businesses and tell people to only use a white laundry. This was the media hostility they faced every single day. So how do you even survive that kind of hostility? Well, you build your own safety net. The community established benevolent associations, basically charitable organizations that stepped right in where the government had utterly failed them. By 1910, these groups had built hospitals, set up schools, helped people find jobs, and crucially, provided legal support. Time and time again, they successfully pressured governments to overturn discriminatory laws. You know, when you look at the young men and women from this era, you're looking at a generation that grew up in Canada, spoke English, and went to English-speaking schools, yet they were still totally excluded from white social clubs. So in 1914, a group down in Victoria decided to found the Chinese Canadian Club for Sports and Book Clubs. This was actually the very first time the term Chinese Canadian was used to identify Canadian-born people of Chinese descent. They were proudly claiming both their heritage and their Canadian identity. All right, Section 3, Italian workers strike back. The struggle against dangerous labor and extreme exploitation. When the Canadian economy boomed in the early 1900s, the government really wanted British immigrants. But what they desperately needed was cheap labor to build out the country's infrastructure. Thousands of Italian men answered that call. These were temporary jobs in railways, mining, shipping, and lumber. The reality? Seasonal work with absolutely zero job security and employers who treated them terribly. But the workers were trapped. They couldn't just walk away from these incredibly dangerous, dirty jobs because they needed to survive and send money back to their families in Italy. To really grasp what they were up against, listen to this quote from an unnamed Ontario lawyer in 1912. He literally called them coarse, rough, uneducated peasants whose only value to Canada was performing the rough, dirty work. It's honestly shocking, but it perfectly illustrates how the establishment viewed Italian workers, just disposable tools for manual labor, rather than equal human beings. Driven by those exhausting, backbreaking conditions, like digging out Toronto's massive sewage system, Italian freight and dock workers decided they weren't just going to take it. Between 1902 and 1912, they engaged in near-annual strikes. They demanded to be treated as actual citizens, not just a cheap workforce. Even though strikes often ended with them being permanently replaced, their sheer stubborn presence allowed Italian communities to finally take root and open their own businesses in major cities like Toronto and Montreal. This brings us to Section 4, Jewish garment workers' protest, and their massive push to unionize against the sweatshops. In the early 1900s, Jewish immigrants were the absolute backbone of the booming garment industry in cities like Toronto and Montreal, mostly because of their prior experience. Now, while Jewish leaders did successfully create unions that protected their culture, like letting them speak Yiddish on the floor and observe holidays, the actual physical factory conditions were horrifyingly unsafe. A staggering 80% of the massive Timothy Eaton Company's workforce was Jewish. We're talking about frail 14-year-old kids working 13-hour days from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. and sometimes even dragging work home with them at night. The exploitation was just immense. The whole thing finally hit a boiling point in February 1912. Eaton tried to force male operators to sew in coat linings for exactly zero extra pay, a move that would also end up costing female workers their jobs. In response, they bravely walked out. What started as just 65 operators skyrocketed into 1,200 workers, including women and young children, lining the freezing streets to demand better conditions. Now, the fallout of this strike tells a really complex story. Timothy Eaton was ruthless. He shut them out, declared that not a single man would be reinstated, and he largely followed through on that threat. The workers eventually ran out of strike pay and failed to get their immediate demands. But if we look at the union's legacy, the movement won a massive long-term victory. They maintained Jewish cultural practices at work, drastically increased public awareness of just how bad sweatshop conditions were, and introduced a whole new generation to the labor movement, basically training its future leaders. And finally, Section 5, connecting past to present and keeping cultural history alive today. The incredible resilience of the Black, Chinese, Italian, and Jewish communities we've talked about isn't just stuck in the past, trapped in old photos. It is very much alive right now, breathing through active cultural preservation. Take Emma Brezel, an 8th grader in Ontario. She connects with her Italian heritage by performing as a Blairin, a traditional folk dancer, at a social club that was founded way back in 1932. By doing the exact same dances in the traditional costumes that her ancestors wore in Italy, she is actively ensuring that these deep, hard-fought roots are never forgotten. It brings her community together and spreads so much joy. And guess what? You can actively document this vital history yourself. By following 4 simple steps using an ArcGIS online story map, you can combine the physical geographical locations of these historical struggles with the powerful narrative texts and photos we've looked at today. It's just a fantastic way to map out the where, the what, and the why of social change. So, I want to leave you with a final thought to really chew on. Knowing the literal mountains of adversity these minority groups overcame, the racism, the exhaustion, the blatant exploitation, and how brilliantly they organized to fight back, how will you step up? How could you organize a cultural group to bring youth together, preserve these incredible stories of resilience, and make absolutely sure they are shared in your own community? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and please keep exploring these vital histories.